Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling, well, a really dense topic, but an absolutely essential one.
Yeah, we're getting into the weeds of political violence.
Specifically, that often confusing intersection between political crime and terrorism. We know you need to grasp these complex ideas quickly and thoroughly, really get beyond the headlines.
Absolutely. It's a territory that gets muddied constantly in public discussion, isn't it? Precision often gets lost in favor of, well, grabbing attention.
Exactly. So our sources today, they provide that much-needed clarity. We're talking clinical definitions, sociological roadmaps, policy implications.
The whole picture, so you, the listener, can move past the surface level and really understand the mechanics behind these illegal acts, the ones designed to destabilize political systems.
Right. Our mission here is sharp analytical clarity. We're going to unpack specific definitions, analyze those motivations, which, as we'll see, run the gamut from sincere conviction to, frankly, pure profit.
And we'll look at the organizational structures, too, often quite rigid, that underpin these actions. We need to separate political crime from terrorism and terrorism from related concepts like insurgency.
So you walk away with the intellectual tools to really dissect global events with genuine depth.
And we have to start at the foundation with the broadest term first, political crime. Our source material nails this down pretty precisely.
What's the core definition they give?
It's defined as illegal acts designed to undermine an existing government and fundamentally threaten its survival. It's a deliberate, systemic challenge to the established order.
Okay, let's really unpack that. What makes a political criminal different from, say, a common thief or someone committing fraud? It seems to boil down to motivation.
That's the core distinction, yes. The source material really emphasizes this. Political criminals often aren't primarily driven by personal financial gain, though that can sometimes be a factor.
Right.
It's more often about principles, deep religious faith, or an unwavering political conviction. They often see themselves as answering a kind of higher calling.
A higher calling. That's a critical difference. Financial crime is usually inherently self-serving, right?
Right, whereas political crime is often framed, at least by the perpetrators, as system-serving for their specific ideology. It's an attack on the legitimacy and the very structure of power itself.
Not just trying to game the system for personal benefit.
Exactly. It's attacking the system itself. Now, we also have to be critical here. This higher calling can sometimes be, let's say, a convenient disguise.
And our sources break down the main goals behind these illegal political acts into 5 categories. It shows just how wide that motivational spectrum really is.
Yeah, let's run through them. First, there's the goal of intimidation.
Okay, so using fear.
Precisely. Using threats, violence, symbolic acts, basically to control populations, silence opposition figures, or maybe manipulate policy outcomes. It's achieving goals through coercion and fear without necessarily needing a full-blown revolution.
Just making people too scared to oppose you.
Yeah, essentially, yes. Then second, you have the really big goal, revolution.
The complete overthrow.
The complete overthrow of the existing government, replacing it with a new regime that aligns with their ideology. Total systemic change is the objective here.
Got it. Third,
and this often hides within the first two, is the straightforward motivation of profit.
Okay, so less higher calling here.
Sometimes, yes. These are individuals or groups who use the chaos or cover of political instability, maybe even a revolution, basically, to enrich themselves. Think smuggling, extortion, seizing state assets.
Right, using the political situation for personal financial gain.
Exactly. Then we get into the 2 crucial categories related to ideology. The fourth goal is pure conviction.
This is the sincere belief.
The sincere, deeply held belief in the cause. The political criminal genuinely believes their actions, even if they're illegal or violent, are justified. They see them as necessary for the greater good according to their ideology, faith, or community. They might see themselves as patriots or liberators.
They truly believe they're doing the right thing.
They believe it. Now, this brings us to the 5th goal, and this is where we need that analytical skepticism we talked about. Pseudo-conviction.
Pseudo-conviction, so faking it.
Essentially, yes. It's the act of feigning sincere conviction. The person or group pretends to be driven by high ideals. They wrap their actions in revolutionary or principled language.
But underneath,
their real primary objective is personal profit, seizing power, or maybe just settling old scores. The ideology is just window dressing.
And recognizing that pseudo-conviction must be incredibly important for analysis.
Oh, absolutely vital. You have to look past the stated motive, look at the actions, look at who actually benefits. Are they genuinely sacrificing for this cause, or are they just accumulating wealth and control while using noble rhetoric?
Spotting that disconnect, the gap between the high-minded talk and the private gain that's critical for assessing any political actor, isn't it? Especially when you're looking at things like corruption.
Precisely. It cuts through the noise.
Okay, this next part is fascinating. It offers a real nugget of insight, especially for understanding how someone actually becomes a political criminal. How does that radicalization process work? Our sources detail a specific, shared pattern of cognitive stages.
Yes, a kind of psychological roadmap. It's the journey from just being unhappy with things to actively engaging in violence. And it's rarely a sudden switch. It's a process, a restructuring of how they see reality.
It starts quite generally.
It usually begins with a generalized complaint. That's stage one. It's not right.
Okay, it's not right. So just identifying a problem.
Exactly. A broad injustice, maybe an ideological issue within the system, poverty, corruption, environmental concerns, whatever it might be. It's often an abstract intellectual dissatisfaction at this point, a feeling that the world isn't as it should be.
But abstract unhappiness doesn't usually lead to illegal acts on its own.
Rarely. For the process to move forward, that grievance needs to become personal. It needs to be internalized. That leads to stage two. It's not fair.
It's not fair. So it shifts from the general to the specific, affecting me.
Right. The individual now believes that the perceived wrong, that policy, that economic gap is unfairly and personally affecting them, or their family, their ethnic group, their way of life. They're not just observing anymore. They feel like a victim.
That emotional investment kicks in.
It's the necessary accelerant, yes. Once that feeling of victimhood is solid, the search for who's responsible begins. That brings us to stage three. It's your fault.
Okay, blame assignment.
Exactly. The anger starts to crystallize and it gets directed towards a specific tangible target. It could be the government leadership, a political party, maybe a powerful corporation, or even an entire opposing ideology.
So it focuses the resentment.
It gives it a concrete target, someone or something specific to blame for their personal suffering or the suffering of their group.
And that leads to the final stage.
The final stage is what ultimately justifies extreme action, often violence. Stage 4, you're evil.
Wow. You're evil. That's a huge leap.
It's the ultimate cognitive restructuring, or what psychologists call moral disengagement. The target, the leader, the party, the group isn't just wrong anymore or misguided or even just at fault. They become dehumanized.
Seen as inherently malicious, fundamentally non-human.
Precisely. And the psychological power of that dehumanization is immense. Once you categorize your target as evil or subhuman, the usual moral breaks, the constraints against violence, they just disappear.
It acts like a psychological permission slip.
It does. It authorizes almost any action, no matter how extreme, because the political criminal believes they aren't fighting legitimate opponents anymore. They believe they're fighting a literal moral contamination, a blight that needs to be removed.
And you see organized groups actively fostering this stage, right? Through propaganda.
Absolutely. Groups looking to radicalize members will constantly hammer home that you're evil narrative. They use specialized propaganda media, maybe controlled education systems, echo chambers online to maintain that crucial psychological distance between their members and the intended victims.
It makes the jump from thinking about violence to actually committing it feel justified, morally unconstrained.
That's the goal, to make it seamless.
Okay, so we've traced that cognitive journey. Now let's get concrete about the types of acts. What specific offenses do our sources classify as political crimes designed to actually alter or control the political process itself?
Right, these are crimes that really strike at the heart of how governance is supposed to work. Crimes of subversion, essentially.
Where do we start?
We can start with fundamental challenges to democratic processes like election fraud.
Seems straightforward, but I imagine the methods are varied.
Oh, definitely. It's not just stuffing ballot boxes anymore, though that might still happen. We're talking manipulating voter registration lists, tampering with voting machines, illegally buying votes, or maybe systematically suppressing the turnout of certain groups of voters.
And the crime isn't just the act itself.
No, the deeper crime is the intentional erosion of the democratic mandate. It undermines public faith in legitimate transfers of power, which is foundational.
Okay, what else falls under this category?
Closely related is abuse of office and public corruption.
So, officials misusing their power.
Exactly. Government officials exploiting their authority, using their power, resources, inside information for illegal personal gain, or maybe to illegally benefit their political allies.
And the impact of that as a political crime.
It's incredibly corrosive because it delegitimizes the entire function of the state in the eyes of the people.
Right. If people think the rules don't apply to those in power,
It directly fuels those it's not right and it's not fair stages we talked about. It creates fertile ground for non-state actors, maybe insurgents or revolutionaries, to gain credibility by positioning themselves as the incorruptible alternative.
then we shift towards national security, right? Loyalty issues.
Yes, crimes directly targeting national security and loyalty. The
Wow.
classic example is treason.
The ultimate betrayal.
It's considered the quintessential political crime, betraying your own country, maybe giving aid and comfort to an enemy, or actively trying to violently overthrow the government. It's the complete abandonment of your civic duty in favor of some opposing political force.
And alongside treason.
Espionage, spying, the illegal gathering, transmitting, or disclosing of confidential government information without authorization.
Often for a foreign power.
Often for a hostile foreign power, yes, or sometimes even for a domestic competitor or group aiming to undermine the state.
Now, with treason and espionage, the digital age must complicate things enormously.
Hugely. It used to be about physical documents, microfilm, clandestine meetings in parks.
The Cold War spy novel stuff.
Right. But today, a massive breach of state secrets can happen in seconds. A single person with a USB drive or a secure internet connection, potentially operating from halfway across the world.
So the definition of aid or disclosure gets stretched.
Dramatically. Tracing these acts, legally proving them, it's incredibly challenging. Intelligence agencies, prosecutors, they're constantly playing catch-up, trying to apply laws written decades ago to brand new technological threats.
The underlying crime betrayal of trust for political or foreign benefit remains the same, but the how is totally transformed.
Exactly. The execution mechanism is revolutionized.
But we flagged this earlier. The conversation about political crime isn't complete if we only look at people acting against the state. We need to tackle the concept of the government itself being the perpetrator. State political crime?
Yes, this is such a critical counterpoint. State political crime happens when the government or its authorized agents engage in illegal acts, often repressive ones against their own citizens or perceived enemies.
Why? What's the goal?
Usually to maintain power, enforce obedience, or crush dissent. Our sources specifically highlight the systematic use of torture as a prime example of state political crime.
Okay, so the whole perspective flips here, doesn't it?
Completely. When the state uses torture, it's wielding the full machinery of government, the training, the budgets, the legal cover, however thin, to commit illegal violence.
It's not some revolutionary acting out of conviction.
No, it's often the opposite. It's an act aimed at preserving the existing power structure, the status quo, through systematic repression.
And these methods become institutionalized.
Often, yes. The police, the military, intelligence services, they become the tools used to carry out policies of oppression, silence dissent, ensure compliance. It's a stark contrast to, say, an insurgent group acting outside the legal framework. Here, the state is using the very power structure it's supposed to uphold to undermine human rights and legitimate political opposition.
And does this connect back to that higher calling idea?
It absolutely can, but in a very cynical way. Those carrying out state political crime are often told they're doing it for national security or maintaining order or fighting enemies of the state.
Which allows them to psychologically justify acts of systematic violence.
Exactly. It links directly back to that final cognitive stage. Dehumanization. They're operating from inside the system, but their actions fundamentally threaten the rule of law and the legitimacy of the state itself.
Okay, so that provides the bridge. We talked about governments as perpetrators. Now let's shift focus to what most people probably think of first. Non-state actors. We move from the broad category of political crime into the more specific, modern framework of terrorism.
Right. And to navigate this properly, we need a really rigorous definition. Let's use the official U.S. State Department view, which is very meticulous, very operational.
Lay it out for us.
Okay. Terrorism is premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated against non-combatant targets by subnational groups or clandestine agents, usually intended to influence an audience.
Wow, okay, there's a lot packed in there. Let's break it down. 4 pillars.
4 non-negotiable pillars. First, it has to be premeditated. It's planned, not spontaneous violence. It must be politically motivated. This is key. It separates terrorism from, say, crimes of passion, random violence, or purely criminal enterprises seeking only profit. There's a political objective.
Third pillar. This seems crucial.
Absolutely crucial, especially for distinguishing it from warfare. The targets must be non-combatant, civilians, or maybe undefended infrastructure, not military personnel in a combat situation.
And the fourth pillar defines the who and the why.
Exactly. The perpetrators are subnational groups or clandestine agents, meaning they aren't typically the uniformed military of a recognized sovereign state, and their ultimate purpose, to influence an audience.
So the violence itself is a form of communication.
Precisely. It's intended to communicate a message through fear, through shock. It's not just about seizing territory or killing specific enemies in the way traditional warfare might be. The act is often a kind of horrifying performance designed to generate political pressure or coerce change.
Okay, that's the core definition. Our sources also clarify the global aspect.
Yes, with 2 related terms. International terrorism specifically involves incidents where the citizens or the territory of more than one country are implicated. This obviously requires cross-border investigation and international cooperation to address.
And a terrorist group.
Simply defined as any group that practices international terrorism or has significant subgroups that do. Now, these definitions, while clear, often get blurred in the media and political talk with other terms.
Like guerrilla, insurgent, revolutionary.
Exactly. For real analytical clarity, we absolutely have to separate these based on their methods and their ultimate goals. They aren't interchangeable.
Okay, let's nail down those distinctions. Start with the guerrilla. What's their focus?
Okay, a guerrilla, the term comes from Spanish for little war, focuses primarily on rural operations. They might infiltrate cities in small bands, but their base is often rural.
And who do they target?
This is key. Their attacks are generally directed at military forces, police, government officials, combatant targets. Their strategy is usually one of attrition, wear down the enemy forces over time.
With what long-term goal?
The long-term aim is often to eventually organize themselves into a more conventional military force, one capable of confronting the state's army directly, almost like a state versus state conflict.
Okay, so targeting combatants, aiming for military parity. How does the insurgent differ? Their goal seems similar, but maybe more complex politically.
It is more complex. An insurgent's goal is typically to confront the existing government to gain control over all or part of its territory, or maybe to force major political concessions, like power sharing.
Okay, so direct challenge for control or influence. What's their defining characteristic?
The defining element is that insurgents simultaneously compete with the government for popular support. They need the people on their side, or at least passively accepting them. They need legitimacy in the eyes of the population they hope to govern.
That raises an interesting point. If their goal is popular support, how do they square that with using violence? Violence often alienates people.
It's a massive strategic challenge, a real contradiction they have to navigate. Insurgents have to calibrate their violence very carefully. They might use it to punish people they see as collaborators with the government, or to enforce their own shadow rules, or coerce compliance in areas they control.
But they can't just terrorize everyone.
No, because they also need to offer something positive. They often provide social services, a form of local justice, maybe protection things the official government might be failing to deliver. They have to build that legitimacy to survive long term.
Whereas a terrorist group, focused purely on influencing an audience through fear, doesn't necessarily need that broad popular support.
Not in the same way. The insurgent absolutely requires it for long-term political viability. The terrorists' leverage comes from psychological impact, not necessarily from governing territory or winning hearts and minds.
Got it. And finally, the revolutionary. How does that term fit?
A revolutionary is typically engaged in a full-scale civil war. This could be nationalists fighting against a colonial or sovereign power, or it could be the existing government fighting against local groups.
And the fight is over fundamental issues.
Yes, usually over fundamental issues of ideology and power. The revolutionary seeks a complete transformation of the state, socio-political, economic, the whole structure. Their conflict is generally larger in scale and more sustained than, say, the hit-and-run tactics of a small terror cell. It often involves large segments of the population and organized militias aiming for total control based on a completely new ideological blueprint.
Understanding these terms requires grounding them in history, too. Terrorism isn't just a modern phenomenon, is it? Its roots go way back.
Way back. Our sources trace some of the earliest activities that fit our modern definition of organized political violence back to minority religious groups.
And what drove that violence back then?
It was often born out of really intense pressure, sometimes existential pressure, and the motivation was often quite fundamental, using violence simply to gain the right to practice their own religion.
Or sometimes to establish their religion's dominance.
Yes, and in many cases, to try and establish the supremacy of their own religious viewpoint over others. It was often an internal struggle, spiritual survival, physical survival, translating into violent action against perceived oppressors or rivals.
Then shifting into the purely political realm.
As we move into political history, the sources note something important. In eras where rulers held absolute power-think monarchies, tyranny's terrorist acts were seen by some as one of the very few means available to actually gain political rights or force any kind of change.
When all the legal doors are slammed shut.
Extreme measures can start to look like the only options, sometimes out of sheer desperation or conviction.
And this history leads us directly to the origin of the words themselves. The term terrorist first gained popularity during
the French Revolution, late 18th century.
And the word terrorism itself.
That began specifically around 1795, and it was used in direct reference to the most infamous phase of that revolution, the Reign of Terror.
Which holds profound historical irony, doesn't it?
A massive irony. We really need to pause on this because it directly informs our understanding of state political crime, which we discussed earlier.
Right. The Reign of Terror wasn't carried out by some secret underground group.
Not at all. It was systematic state-sanctioned violence. The revolutionary government itself, under Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety, used mass executions via the guillotine, pervasive surveillance, and widespread oppression.
And their justification.
To defend the revolution and crush internal dissent, real or imagined.
So the word terrorism originally described a government using brutal, centralized power against its own citizens.
Precisely. To enforce obedience and ideological conformity. It was initially a negative label for state repression. Only over the following centuries, especially with the rise of anarchist movements, nationalist struggles, did the meaning gradually shift.
To primarily describe the violence of non-state actors challenging the government.
Exactly. That historical context is so important. It reminds us that the state can be, indeed historically was, the original perpetrator of what was first labeled terrorism. It grounds our understanding of state crime today.
Okay, let's bring it back to the contemporary world. Terrorism today isn't monolithic. It shows up across a wide spectrum of ideologies and aims. Our sources give us a kind of taxonomy of modern forms. Let's start with revolutionary terrorists.
Right. These actors have a clear political agenda, complete systemic replacement. Revolutionary terrorists use violence primarily to frighten those currently in power, the ruling elite, military leaders, their supporters.
And the ultimate goal.
To replace the existing government entirely with a regime that holds political or religious views they deem acceptable. They're aiming for structural collapse and then ideological substitution.
Okay. Next category.
Next, we have the very broad category of political terrorists. These are defined by their intense ideological opposition to specific targeted groups.
How does that targeting work?
Political terrorism is specifically directed at people or groups who oppose the terrorists' political ideology. Or, perhaps more chillingly, groups whom the terrorists simply define as outsiders, people who, in their view, must be destroyed. This can lead to things like ethnic or religious cleansing campaigns.
Now, it's crucial here, given the nature of this category, that we stick strictly to reporting the source material impartially.
Absolutely imperative. Our sources explicitly mention that both right-wing political groups and left-wing political groups can fall into this category when they employ violence against their ideological opponents or those they label as outsiders.
So the key factor isn't the specific ideology itself.
No. The defining characteristic is the use of violence to enforce political conformity or to eliminate perceived opponents. It doesn't matter where that ideology sits on the left-right spectrum. If violence is the tool against defined others, it fits this category according to our sources.
Understood. Moving on, we encounter nationalist terrorism. What's the focus here?
This form is tightly focused on promoting the interests of a specific minority, ethnic, or religious group.
Driven by a sense of grievance.
Yes, usually driven by a powerful conviction that their group has been systematically persecuted, discriminated against, or oppressed under majority rule.
And their goal is tangible.
Very tangible, usually geographical. They want to carve out their own independent homeland. This might mean outright secession, or perhaps establishing autonomous regions within an existing state.
And history shows this often involves violence aimed at.
Often aimed at expelling the majority or the ruling population from the territory they claim. It's about forcing political accommodation, forcing border changes, through violence and coercion.
Now, this type of terrorism, based on minority grievance, inherently brings up a policy question that the source material seems to hint at.
It does. Could prevention programs be implemented? Could giving these minority ethnic or religious groups a better, more effective voice within the existing system potentially help prevent nationalist terrorism?
It's a critical question for analysis, isn't it?
It's profound. If the root cause is genuinely perceived persecution and a belief that the political system offers no way to address grievances legitimately, then maybe providing robust, institutionalized channels for political expression, cultural protection, and addressing those grievances could undercut the appeal of violence.
Shifting the conflict from violence to negotiation.
Potentially. Of course, the success of that kind of approach hinges entirely on the willingness of the ruling majority or the state to offer real concessions, real power sharing, real avenues for being heard. That's often the sticking point.
Okay, next on the list, retributive terrorism. The motivation here sounds different again.
It is. The motivation for retributive terrorism is fundamentally moral or theological, often in a very harsh sense.
What's the core desire?
The core desire is to impose a very specific social and religious code onto others. The violence here acts as a form of punishment, a way to enforce a strict theological or moral order that the terrorists believe is universally required, or at least required within their sphere of influence.
So it transcends local political goals.
Often, yes. It might seek global adherence or at least regional adherence to a strict, non-negotiable code derived from their interpretation of religious law or ideology.
And then completing the circle, we come back to the state with state-sponsored terrorism.
Right. As we defined it earlier, this occurs when a repressive government regime uses its official, authorized force to compel its citizens into obedience, systematically oppresses minorities, and stifles any form of political dissent. The mechanism of institutional force is what defines it.
Okay, one more category, which reflects the modern, more decentralized threat. Lone actor terrorists, the so-called lone wolves.
Yes. This is a significant challenge for counterterrorism efforts.
What specifically marks someone as a lone actor, as opposed to just a member of a cell?
They might be deeply inspired by a known terrorist group, maybe ISIS or Al-Qaeda or some other ideology. They might admire them, consume their propaganda voraciously.
Yeah.
But the definition hinges on operational autonomy. The key is that they do not receive orders, direction, specific support, or funding from that group. Their planning, their target selection, the execution of the attack, it's all done independently.
And that lack of a direct communication link makes them incredibly hard to detect.
It's extremely difficult. Traditional intelligence gathering often focuses on tracking communications, financial flows, networks. The lone actor, by definition, operates outside those networks, making them a particularly elusive and dangerous threat.
Understanding how these groups actually operate, their internal structure, gives us crucial insight into why they can be so resilient. Let's delve into the inner mechanics. How are they typically organized?
Broadly speaking, groups tend to be organized in one of two main ways, either hierarchical or networked.
Like a traditional pyramid versus something more spread out.
Exactly. Hierarchical structures, like you'd see in a conventional army or a corporation, have clear chains of command. They can be very efficient for directing action, but they have a major vulnerability. If you can compromise the leadership at the top, decapitation, as it's often called, the whole structure can potentially collapse or be severely disrupted.
Okay, so the alternative is the network structure.
Yes, and this is the model many modern terrorist groups favor precisely because it's built for survival and resilience.
And this brings us to the concept of terror cells. These are the basic units.
They are the fundamental building blocks of these networked affiliates. To really grasp their operational advantage, don't think of it like a chain of command. Think more like a modular computer network, or maybe like franchise outlets.
How does that independence work?
Each cell is designed to be functionally independent like a separate node in the network. And crucially, for security, each member of, say, Cell A ideally has a little or absolutely no knowledge about the members or the specific activities of Cell B or Cell C.
So if law enforcement manages to infiltrate or capture Cell B,
they hit a firewall. They have zero immediate operational intelligence about Cell A's plans or Cell C's identities. This compartmentalization is the ultimate security feature.
it offers extreme resilience.
It does. because the failure of one module, one cell, doesn't automatically compromise the entire system. This decentralized networked model is a huge reason why completely dismantling major terrorist organizations remains such a persistent, ongoing challenge for security forces worldwide.
Now, let's tackle that eternal, very complex question. What actually motivates someone to become a terrorist? It's probably not just one thing. Our sources bring together several academic and psychological perspectives.
Definitely not just one thing. Radicalization is almost always a complex brew, a confluence of different factors.
Okay, what's one perspective?
Well, there's the psychological view. This perspective suggests that some terrorists might be emotionally disturbed individuals. They might be acting out pre-existing psychological issues, perhaps psychoses, but they find a structure and validation for their feelings within these violent groups.
So the group provides an outlet and a justification they wouldn't have alone.
Exactly. The group gives them a framework, a sense of belonging, maybe even a kind of moral authority for actions that stem from deeper personal disturbances.
Okay, what else?
Then there's the alienation view, which strongly links political violence to socioeconomic conditions.
Lack of opportunity, economic hardship.
Yes. This view argues that things like a pervasive lack of economic opportunity, high unemployment, systemic exclusion from the mainstream economy, these factors are positively correlated with the appeal of terrorism.
How does that connection work?
Well, if legitimate paths to success, status, and self-worth seem completely blocked, then radical action which might promise power, respect within the group, ideological purpose, even martyrdom can start to look like a more compelling alternative.
The perceived failure of the system fuels that it's not fair stage.
Precisely. It makes people vulnerable to narratives that blame the system and offer a radical solution.
Our sources also mention a family conflict view.
Yes, this suggests that perhaps dysfunctional family backgrounds, maybe experiences of abuse, neglect, or poor emotional attachment, could predispose some individuals to seek out the intense, almost family-like camaraderie offered by extremist groups.
The group becomes a substitute family, providing belonging.
It provides the stability, the identity, the intense loyalty that might have been missing in their personal lives.
And what about the purely political context?
We absolutely have to emphasize the political view, and particularly the role of failed states or ungoverned spaces.
Where the government has lost control.
Exactly. Where the central government has lost legitimacy, can't provide basic services like security or justice, that power vacuum is almost inevitably filled by non-state actors, and that includes terrorist organizations.
And they step in to provide services.
Sometimes, yes. They might offer their own brutal form of justice, some basic security, maybe even rudimentary infrastructure. By doing so, they gain a degree of local legitimacy and can create safe havens for recruitment, training, and planning operations.
Okay. Perhaps one of the most powerful explanations, sociologically speaking, is the socialization friendship view.
This one is really interesting. It suggests that people often get drawn into these groups less because they've deeply studied the ideology, and more because of simple group dynamics, peer pressure, friendship.
So it's about the bonds within the group.
Very much so. Individuals form tight-knit groups, and these groups reinforce shared beliefs. Intense solidarity develops. The commitment can shift from being primarily about the grand political goal to being about loyalty to your friends, your comrades in the cell.
So someone might participate in violence.
Not necessarily out of burning ideological fanaticism, but because they don't want to let their friends down. They don't want to seem cowardly or disloyal. That group loyalty becomes this incredibly powerful glue that can override personal moral doubts or hesitations.
And finally, we have the straightforward ideological view.
Which covers that sincere conviction we talked about earlier. This perspective simply emphasizes that holding extreme religious and ideological beliefs, including what might be termed religious fanaticism, is itself the primary driver. The ideology inherently prompts and justifies the violent behavior in the believer's mind.
Now, let's loop this back quickly to state actors.
Yeah.
How do those involved in state-sponsored terrorism manage the morality of their actions?
They too are psychologically vulnerable, but they are vulnerable to official ideology that dehumanizes their targets.
And the state provides the mechanism for that.
Yes, through systematic, active propaganda. State actors, state-controlled media, they deploy sophisticated narratives to psychologically distance the perpetrators, the soldiers, the police, the intelligence agents from the people they're targeting.
Oh, by painting them as threats.
Exactly. Painting dissidents, minorities, or opposition groups as existential threats, as traitors, vermin, terrorists themselves, fundamentally non-human or subhuman. This allows state agents to carry out systematic abuse, torture, imprisonment, even mass killings, without suffering immediate psychological breakdown or overwhelming moral conflict. The propaganda provides the necessary mental shield.
Okay, so we've looked at definitions, motivations, structures. Now let's assess the current situation. Despite decades of effort, massive resources, intelligence gathering, military actions aimed at countering terrorism, our sources confirm a rather stark reality.
Yes, the hard truth is that the threat of global terrorism persists. It still exists, and perhaps more importantly, it demonstrates profound resilience.
Resilience linked to that network structure we discussed, and the deep motivations.
Directly linked, yes. And the data backs this up. Figures from START, that's the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, actually showed that, disturbingly, both the number of terrorist attacks and the resulting fatalities have increased globally in recent years.
So the idea that you can just cut off the head of the snake, it doesn't really hold.
It's rarely that simple. Decapitation strategies taking out key leaders might feel like victories, and they can disrupt operations temporarily. But they're rarely fatal blows to these networked groups.
Because the structure is designed for succession.
Exactly. When significant pressure is applied, even when a prominent leader is killed or captured, the network is often designed so that another individual, often just as motivated, is ready to step up and take command. The ideological drive and the operational knowledge continue.
Which means the response has to be multi-pronged.
Absolutely. It necessitates a really complex, multifaceted response that combines security measures, legal tools, and political strategies.
Okay, let's look at those. On the security front in the U.S., a major player is federal law enforcement, particularly the Department of Homeland Security, DHS.
DHS is central, yes. It's crucial to understand its scope. It was created largely in response to the 9/11 attacks, consolidating many different agencies.
And its responsibilities are broad.
Extremely broad. Everything from border security, protecting critical infrastructure like power grids and transportation, cybersecurity, and critically, for our discussion, anti-terrorism preparedness, intelligence analysis, and sharing that intelligence across federal, state, and local law enforcement lines. It's meant to be the central hub for domestic security coordination against threats like terrorism.
And alongside law enforcement, there's the legal system.
Yes, a major part of the response involves combating terrorism with the courts, using the judicial process investigations, indictments, trials, convictions to prosecute terror plots, disrupt networks, and hold individuals and sometimes organizations legally accountable.
And the legal tools themselves have evolved and been debated.
Constantly debated and refined. It's often a tightrope walk, trying to balance the urgent need for security and intelligence gathering with the protection of fundamental civil liberties.
Our sources specifically flag two major pieces of U.S. legislation here, the USAPA, the USA Patriot Act, and its later modification, the USA Freedom Act.
Right. The Patriot Act, passed very quickly after 9/11, significantly expanded the surveillance powers of U.S. law enforcement and intelligence agencies.
Things like monitoring communications, conducting searches.
Yes, and making it easier to share intelligence between agencies like the FBI and CIA. The core policy idea was to break down walls and prioritize gathering national security intelligence, sometimes lowering the traditional legal hurdles required for criminal investigations.
But it generated huge controversy over civil liberties.
Immense controversy, particularly around provisions that allowed for things like the bulk collection of telephone metadata and other forms of mass surveillance, concerns about privacy, government overreach.
Which led to the USA Freedom Act later on. What did that do?
The USA Freedom Act aimed to address some of the most controversial aspects of the Patriot Act. Most notably, it ended the government's bulk collection of domestic phone records by the NSA, shifting the storage requirement to the phone companies themselves, requiring more specific court orders to access them. It also added some transparency and oversight mechanisms.
While keeping other intelligence tools in place.
Yes, it refined rather than dismantled many capabilities. So these two laws really encapsulate that ongoing push and pull in policy circles, the constant tension between wanting maximum security effectiveness and needing to uphold the fundamental democratic values and civil liberties the government is supposed to be defending.
Okay, so security and legal tools are part of the response, but often they're not enough on their own, especially for long-term solutions. This brings us to the political approach, sometimes called the soft power approach, combating terrorism with politics.
Right. This strategy digs deeper. It focuses less on just kinetically eliminating terrorists or cells and more on undermining the support structure that allows these groups to thrive in the first place.
Attacking their legitimacy.
Exactly. It's fundamentally a battle for legitimacy. If terrorist groups draw strength from populations that feel alienated, oppressed, or ignored by their own governments, then the political strategy aims to change that dynamic.
And how does that translate into action? The term used is benevolent nation building.
It means engaging constructively, often involving significant foreign aid, helping develop infrastructure like schools and hospitals, supporting education programs, providing humanitarian assistance. Essentially, helping nations that might be vulnerable to or currently housing terror groups to become more stable, prosperous, and functional.
What's the theory behind that? How does building a school counter terrorism?
The idea is that if the local population starts to see a legitimate, functioning government, perhaps supported by international partners, actually delivering tangible benefits, providing real economic opportunities, offering reliable justice and security.
Then they'll be less likely to support or tolerate the extremist groups.
Precisely. They'll hopefully withdraw their consent, the passive acceptance, maybe even actively oppose the non-state terror groups operating in their midst. It becomes a direct competition for loyalty and legitimacy.
So the terrorist group offers radical ideology and often coercion.
While the political approach, the nation-building approach, seeks to offer stability, opportunity, and a stake in a legitimate future.
It directly targets that alienation factor we discussed as a motivator.
Exactly. If people feel they have a real stake in their political system, if they see paths to economic improvement, if they feel their grievances can be addressed through legitimate channels, the appeal of radicalization, that feeling of it's not right, it's not fair, it's your fault, is significantly weakened. It offers a potential long-term, non-military path toward diminishing the threat.
Right. This has been necessarily detailed, a real deep dive into some very complex definitions and, frankly, some difficult realities.
Yeah.
Just to quickly pull together the key takeaways. We started by clearly defining political crime. Those illegal acts driven by conviction, or sometimes profit disguised as conviction, aimed at undermining the state. We detail that spectrum of 5 goals, from raw intimidation to that insidious fake-out of pseudo-conviction.
And critically, we mapped out that chilling psychological pathway, the 4 cognitive stages. That shared pattern transforming abstract unhappiness into violence justified in the perpetrator's mind. It's not right, then. It's not fair. Escalating to, it's your fault. And finally, that crucial moral disengagement of, you're evil. We then gave you the tools to analytically separate terrorism, that premeditated violence against non-combatants for political influence, from the distinct goals and methods of the guerrilla, the insurgent, and the revolutionary.
Understanding the structure was also vital. Grasping the strategic edge provided by those networked terror cells, operating with that functional independence designed purely for survival and resilience against counter-terror efforts. And we connected all back to the why, reviewing those multiple overlapping motivations, from individual psychological factors and economic alienation right through to the undeniable power of group socialization, friendship, and pure ideological fervor.
Yeah, and having these precise definitions, understanding these structures and motivations, it genuinely allows you, the listener, to process global events, to understand security policy debates with much greater clarity, with real analytical depth that moves you far beyond just the surface-level news cycle.
Absolutely. And if we connect all this knowledge now to the biggest possible picture, we saw 2 powerful competing forces at play in this whole landscape. On one side, we analyzed how governments themselves can use official propaganda to systematically dehumanize target populations as part of state-sponsored terror, effectively justifying violence and oppression from the top down.
But then, on the other side, we looked at political solutions aimed at non-state terror, involving strategies like benevolent nation building, using aid, development, and building legitimacy to counter extremism from the ground up.
So here's the final thought to leave you with. How do these 2 fundamentally opposed approaches, one using aid, transparency, and trying to build goodwill, the other using dehumanizing ideology and systematic oppression, how do they actually compete for power and influence on the world stage?
And maybe more importantly, which one of these forces, benevolence or dehumanization, holds the true long-term power to genuinely, sustainably shift the global landscape of political violence away from extremism? That's a really significant, necessary question for you to consider as you watch events unfold.
Thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive.
We look forward to our next analysis together.